We saw no television. Nobody read the newspapers. There was no radio. We were schooled within our own community. I'd never gone to a supermarket. I'd never even held a dollar bill, which is pretty funny given that I ended up in the world of finance. So she made the determination. She informed my parents that that was what was going to happen. They had no say in the matter. And 2 hours after I graduated from high school there, I was gone. And meanwhile, Sister Catherine, on the other hand, was this, fiercer than warlike warrior woman. And all I ever wanted was to have her love me because nobody else was allowed to. This book that I just wrote, Breaking Glass, Tales from the Witch of Wall Street, is dedicated to the mentors that I had. And during my rise from receptionist on Wall Street to ultimately becoming a global partner at Invesco, I had some extraordinary mentors. Not surprisingly, all of them were men.
I'm just so enthusiastic about having this conversation with you. When I think about the American dream, how anyone in this country has the opportunity to rise from meager upbringing to building an impactful life, you're a standout because yours was not a meager upbringing. You grew up in a religious cult that deprived you of any knowledge of the outside world, any emotional support from your family, which they even broke up. It was a strict rules-ridden environment where routine punishment would be recognized as torture in most of the world. You were expelled at age 17 from an environment that cultivated dependence, and you went on to a position at the pinnacle of Wall Street at a time when women didn't do that. Folks, I hope you enjoy this episode because this story is difficult to fathom, and there are so many fascinating elements that we're going to explore. But what we cover is explained in 2 books that you must read. Little Sister, a memoir, and the second is Breaking Glass, Tales from the Witch of Wall Street. That was just published last week. I couldn't recommend them more highly. Patricia, I was fortunate enough to have been assigned to your firm, Chancellor Capital Management, on one of my first assignments after joining Morgan Stanley in 1991. While some may have called you the Witch of Wall Street then, all I knew was that you were the key person at Chancellor, and Chancellor was one of our largest clients. And I couldn't have been more honored to have gotten to know you and your firm. Patricia, how did you do it?
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. And frankly, I did it with a lot of help. This book that I just wrote, Breaking Glass, Tales from the Witch of Wall Street, is dedicated to the mentors that I had. And during my rise from receptionist on Wall Street to ultimately becoming a global partner at Invesco, I had some extraordinary mentors. Not surprisingly, all of them were men.
Well, I have to say that that is giving a lot of credit elsewhere, where maybe a lot of credit actually belongs with you, only because there is an emotional element to this that you were able to push through. There were so many striking things about the book, particularly your childhood, which is what I'd love to talk about a little bit in the beginning. Why don't we talk a little bit about how that all started?
Yes, I was actually born into it. The center, which was originally called St. Benedict Center, was an organization that was founded in 1940, 8 years before I was born, by a very Catholic woman who was trying to find an opportunity for Harvard and Radcliffe students who were Catholic to engage, and almost like a Newman Society in some colleges. And my father became introduced to it when he got out of World War II as a naval officer and was getting his master's degree in philosophy at Boston College. And my mother came to the organization as an 18-year-old freshman at Boston University who was Episcopalian and coming into the Catholic Church. And it was love at first sight in a way. They got married in 47 and I was born in 48. The head of the organization, the titular head in a way, but was Father Leonard Feeney, a renowned Jesuit who was a poet, he was an essayist, he was a theologian. He converted many young men and women who were in the universities around the area to becoming Catholic. He married many people, and he sent many people off to the seminary. He was kind of a visionary, but somewhere along the line, he broke with the general hierarchy of the Catholic Church in the area that was looking for a more ecumenical engagement with religions, other religions. And he was very adamant that there was a dogma of the Catholic Church that said outside the Catholic Church, there was no salvation. And the cardinal at the time, well, he became cardinal, but Archbishop Cushing, asked him to tone it down, and he would not. And pretty soon, a lot of the students from Harvard and Radcliffe and surrounding colleges abandoned him. But there was a small cadre of people, about 50 men and women, who supported him. Some of them were married, some of them were single. And when I was 5 months old, they formed a religious community that they called the Slaves of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. And it was shortly after that that my father and two other professors, very close friends of his, who were part of the organization, were fired from their teaching positions at Boston College for their adherence to the dogma that they called Feeney's dogma. And when that happened, the rest of the organization kind of closed ranks together. My parents, who had bought a house on the GI Bill, sold the house, turned the proceeds over to the organization. And that started this community where, each family had their own apartment, and it was fine. And we lived in a cluster of houses. But we had all of our meals together, said mass in secret, and we were starting to be schooled. I was just a tiny little girl, but it was all within the community. I thought it was the most wonderful life. I knew no other. People would take me down to the Charles River and pick dandelions with me. These people were very, very bright, very well educated. And then one day when I was about 5 years old, 4 to 5 years old, they built this huge red stockade fence around the houses. There were 7 houses where all the families were living. And there were now about 30 to 35 children, eventually becoming 39 children, 60 men and women. So a group of about 100 people. And then when I was 6, I was the oldest of 5 children. So my baby sister was only months old. And when I was 6, they separated the children from the parents.
This show is being brought to you by our sponsor, Trueflation. Professional investors and economists, and probably any casual observers, know that government inflation statistics are only an approximation of what real inflation is. Not only that, but the government has a conflict of interest because high inflation can be so damaging to the economy, the deficit, and our $34 trillion in debt. Trueflation collects over 13 million pricing data points. Most are updated daily to reveal inflation with precision for asset managers, governments, companies, and the general public. Check them out at trueflation.com.
Not the infants who were allowed to stay with the parents, but anyone that was over 3. And then shortly thereafter, Father Feeney coerced the married couples into taking vows of celibacy. And at first, my parents pushed back very hard, and my father was adamant about not complying with that. And later on, they both told me, that they thought they would be forced to leave the organization if they hadn't agreed to it. And so I then found out many years later was that the children of one of the other parents was told by his parents that Father Feeney had done the same thing to his parents. In other words, it was a divide and conquer strategy to gain control over every element of family life, private life. And my parents, conformed. And we then left Cambridge when I was 9 years old and moved out to a place about 30 miles west of Boston called Harvard, Mass. And then we entered into a really monastic life. We saw no television. Nobody read the newspapers. There was no radio. We were schooled within our own community. I'd never gone to a supermarket. I'd never even held a dollar bill, which is pretty funny given that I ended up in the world of finance. And we were being dedicated as children. We were told that we were the luckiest 39 children in the world because we have been dedicated to God from the moment we were born. And that dedication meant, in the mind of Father Feeney and Catherine Clark, whom we called Sister Catherine, that meant that we would all remain within the community and that the young girls would grow up and become nuns and the boys would become brothers. And she would now have this community of 100 adults living this monastic contemplative life, which is all built around the dogma of no salvation outside the Catholic Church. What happened to me was when I was about 14, I was one of the oldest children. When I was about 14, I started getting crushes on boys. And that put an alarm bell in Sister Catherine's head. And I had no idea why it happened. It was the most chaste, crush in the world. But she decided that she needed me gone. Because if she couldn't control that element, and for me, the idea of being a nun was the last thing in the world I wanted to be. I always had this, fairy tale dream of a prince coming along and sweeping me off my feet and whisking me off to some castle where we would have lots of children. I'm not even knowing a clue how any of that happened. So she made the determination. She informed my parents that was what was going to happen. They had no say in the matter. And 2 hours after I graduated from high school there, I was gone. My parents remained there. My siblings remained there. My siblings were not even aware, except for one of them, that I was going to be leaving. And when some of the children then went to Sister Catherine afterward and said, "Why is she gone?" her response to them was that I, a 17-year-old, very naive young woman, was destroying the vocations of the men, as though I was a scarlet letter woman. So that's a synopsis.
You were going to ruin their perfect world.
That's right.
What there was you skipped over a particular sister, Matilda, who had an interesting role for a while in your childhood after the separation. I'd love for people to hear about her.
She was actually one of the mothers. She had been raised in a very Catholic environment in Pennsylvania by the Madams of the Sacred Heart, and she was put in charge of all the children. And she was a disciplinarian that in some ways ultimately could have made Sister Catherine look tame. And, we were very, very tiny. And I remember, 3, 4, 5 years old. And she made a rule one day that we were not allowed to hold the hands of our little siblings. And at the time, my baby sister was just learning to walk. And I loved to let her hold my fingers as I walked backward. And she was trying to walk. And
when you wrote about how you thought this rule may have been actually specifically targeting you.
Well, I began to think, why am I always getting into trouble? Nobody else seemed to get into trouble. But, you learn to live with the rules that you're given. And you find ways. I don't look back on my childhood and say this was the most horrible childhood in the world.
Well, that's the remarkable thing, frankly, because this woman did wind up, physically hitting you all and starving you in, basically, giving your sister food that your sister would need and having it returned to her meal after meal after meal. Pretty devastating, pretty shocking. And I find it fascinating. Your style of writing is terrific because it moves right along very quickly. And you write about these things dispassionately. And you even, it's okay, this happened to me, rather than no wonder it didn't work out. Look at the hand I was dealt. But there is a matter of factness of how you portray all this. It's just fascinating. And points to a resilience that undoubtedly helped over time. One of the things that you mentioned is that Perhaps Sister Catherine played a role subconsciously in how you approached the world once you found out what it was.
Yes, and I think I'd like to, in speaking about this, contrast and compare her to another woman who was at the center, who was Sister Anne Mary. And Sister Anne Mary was the principal of our school. She was a Radcliffe grad. I think she had gotten her master's degree. And her father was the principal of a school in Clinton, the high school in Clinton. So she had the genetic tendency for being a teacher. And she was an extraordinary teacher. I remember having her in the second grade when I was reading, and I certainly had her in math in high school. I mean, it was quite astounding that she could teach everything. She spoke beautifully, and she made sure that every one of us spoke grammatically correctly. And she was always there as a guide. And I say that because within the community, there was no way of communicating with our parents. We were not allowed to address our parents or speak to them. And I will tell you a little later when we get into it why I don't think I was destroyed by this organization. And then there was Sister Catherine, the all-powerful, all-knowing person that ran this organization of 100 people. Father Feeney may have been the titular head, but she was more than the power behind the throne. She really sat on the throne. She made all the rules, and there was not one man or one woman who pushed back at her and said no. And so when I left, I had these two images of people. One was Sister Anne Mary, who was immensely dedicated to teaching, never hit a child ever. And she could get upset with us if we were misbehaving, but she never ever hit anyone. And I remember in those last few months when I was there, and only I knew I was going to be leaving. None of the other children did. Very few of the grown-ups did. And she was told, and she would bring me into a room in the afternoon, one of the little classrooms we had, and she would be so enthusiastic for me. She would say, "You are going to do very, very well." Nobody ever told me that I did anything well. And she said, "You have the best of your parents in you." Now, within the community, we weren't even allowed to treat our parents as though they were members of our family. And so for her to be telling me I was like my parents made me feel so happy, so warm. I so appreciated her in that role. She spoke beautifully. She would always give advice. Just remember that, your elders have been around a lot longer than you have, and they know a lot more than you do, but always with kind of advice and counsel. Sister Catherine, on the other hand, was this major force. I looked at Sister Anne Mary as a wonderful mentor. And in my book that's dedicated to my mentors, all of them are men. And I thought, you know what? I have to include Sister Anne Mary. It may not have been while I was on Wall Street, but the mentoring she gave me confidence, prepared me, and let me know that I could reach whatever I wanted to do. And meanwhile, Sister Catherine, on the other hand, was this, fiercer than warlike warrior woman. And all I ever wanted was to have her love me, because nobody else was allowed to. She was the only one that could dispense love within the organization. And I never could reach that relationship with her. I was always somehow doing something wrong. And
disappointing her in some way.
In some way. And yet, when I went out into the world, some people have said, well, how come you weren't afraid of some of these roles you would be put into, or the challenges that you would be asked? And I just remember, only with the benefit of hindsight, as I was writing this second book, I remember thinking, well, the role model that I had, the only role model I had for all intents and purposes outside of Sister Anne Mary, was someone for whom there was no fear. She knew what she wanted and she got it. And I think, in a way, I entered the world with no preconceived notion that because I was a woman or a girl at that point, I couldn't do something. And so while I'm not thanking her per se, I think that I learned from that ability, from that strength of character or strength of personality, that I could do something.
Yeah, in a sense, it was everybody's reporting to her, and she does have the power. And so women can have the power to move in a way they want the organization to move in. Is that's part of it as well, isn't it?
Very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so. I never thought I can't do this because I'm a woman. Never.
Well, you also draw a distinction between role models and mentors, which is
Absolutely.
very much worth exploring.
You know, I had someone the other day when I was talking about this, a young person say, I had a terrible mentor. I said, whoa, 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 whoa. No, that was not a mentor. Mentors are good people. A mentor relationship is one where you're seeking, you're asking for help, and someone else is generous enough to share their time with you, who is interested in you just for your own good and to help you. So mentors are always positive. If they are not, then they haven't been a mentor and they have been serving themselves rather than you. Role models, on the other hand, can be good or bad. And we often hear that sometimes people who grew up in a very unpleasant environment relive that environment because that role model was the only thing they knew how to copy. And I think with role models, you have to know whether they're good role models or not good role models. In the case of Sister Catherine, I would never, and I had 2 children, as you know, I never raised the children anything like the way we were raised. And it never occurred to me that that could possibly be the right way to raise children. On the other hand, I somehow gleaned from her that being a woman was no liability in the world of business.
Well, you certainly were able to handle all of these adversities quite well through your childhood. And then Sister Elizabeth Ann, your mom, and Sister Catherine delivers you the message that time has come. Explain that and the emotions that must have been roaring through you.
Yes, it was somehow, in a way, cryptic. I had never ever been into her office, and believe me, I had been called into her office easily 100 times over the 10 years I'd been living there. And there was my mother standing there and thinking, what is going on? And I suddenly thought, oh, maybe something terrible has happened to my father, whom I only thought of as Brother James Aloysius. And then Sister Catherine had this very endearing voice, and she basically said, you know, not everyone is called to be a nun. And I thought, well, I certainly knew that thought. And she said to me that, you know, she started describing life in the world. And I was completely thrown off. What is she talking to me about? What is this monologue about? And all of a sudden I realized she was telling me that I was no longer going to be allowed to live there. Now, you might have thought, oh, I thought that was fantastic, but it was the only place I'd ever known as home. My whole family lived there, and while we were not allowed to talk to each other, and while there were plenty of rules and regulations, it still was home, and I loved it. And
it was the only thing that you could have possibly known.
Exactly. And I said, I was panicked, and I said, well, I thought I was going to go that night. And this was in October. And I said, well, can I finish high school here? Oh, yes, dear, of course. And I said, does Brother James Aloysius know about this? Yes, but please don't tell anyone else. The community would be very upset. So she's telling me that everybody, the only people I knew in the world and loved, would be very upset to find that I was being kicked out. Now, within our community, there were people who were occasionally kicked out. They were adults. And when you were kicked out of the center, you were as good as dead. Nobody ever brought your name up again. You were not allowed to speak about them. And I already had that realization. So I'm going to be gone, and then nobody's ever going to think about me again. And I just was beyond upset. I still had a few months to go. I had been accepted at 2 colleges, Vassar and Bates, not because Sister Catherine had any intention of allowing me to go, because she said it would destroy my soul if I went, but she needed to have the school accredited. I was a very good student. And when we made those applications and I got accepted, not surprisingly, shortly thereafter, the school became accredited. But I had to write a note saying that I wasn't going to be coming. So that June, when I left, Sister Catherine had already made arrangements that I could go to secretarial school, with her idea being that she would allow me to live in a remote place, part of the property, while I was going to secretarial school. And the moment I got out and had a job, I was on my own. And when that happened, I got my first apartment, which was a room at the YWCA in the south end of Boston, a very non-chic part of Boston. And the only girls there, as you can imagine, and we shared, it was a communal bathroom halfway down the hall. And I had a tiny little room with a window, a bed, a dresser, and a closet. And that was my first apartment.
And your mentoring, kind of the outside world mentoring, started soon thereafter. Probably since you started this by talking about how mentors are responsible for your success, and I pushed back. Let's talk about the mentors and how they started and what role they played and how they helped you survive in this strange world that you wound up finding yourself in.
You're right. The first real job, I did teach typing for a little while, which wasn't very gratifying. And I always knew to myself, I've got to find a way to go to college. I went to an agency to find a job, and I brought my credentials. The credentials consisted of 2 numbers: how fast I could type and how fast I could take shorthand. And she sent me to two different interviews. She had mentioned the names of the companies. The one was the Atlantic Monthly, which of course I knew was a magazine that was headquartered right on Newbury Street. I knew exactly where they were. And I thought, oh, that could be really interesting. Maybe that will be an intellectual environment and I'll be able to learn and maybe go to college. And the other was a company called Ladenburg Thalmann. Never heard of them. And they were a brokerage firm down on Franklin Street in Boston. That was my first interview of the 2. I went down there and met the 2 partners, a man named George Burden and a man named Godfrey Burkhead. And within about half an hour, they had offered me a job at $90 a week. And then they said, and can you start tomorrow? Unfortunately, I could. So I showed up the next day with one objective. I wanted to be the best receptionist in the world. I didn't really know everything that a receptionist did. I knew I had to answer the phone. I knew I had to help the brokers. And I think that experience for me was very rewarding, because I thought, I have a new life now. And I really said, everything in the past is behind me. And I have turned over this leaf, and I am going to be the world's best receptionist. And one of the things that I found myself comfortable doing was raising my hand to help. I did not want to be bored at that front desk. And so I would offer to cut articles out for the brokers from the ticker tape, and I would get their lunches and fix their telephones. I just was constantly wanting to be of use. And about 6 months later, George Burden called me into his office and said, we're really, really pleased with the job you're doing, and we're going to raise your salary to $100 a week. And I quickly did the arithmetic and went, well, that's 11%, but it's 6 months. That's 22% annually. I thought, wow, this is great. So then that Christmas, he called me into his office. He said that this is the time of the year when we give bonuses. And I'm going, bonuses? Nobody ever told me about a bonus with this job. and he gave me a $1,500 check. It was a third of my paycheck. And that was when I started to invest. And I had also memorized every stock ticker for the New York Stock Exchange, because I had to do, and you'll remember some of these things called S&P tear sheets. I mean, you probably don't really know them as well as I do, but these tear sheets had to be replaced every 3 months, and it was the most boring job, most awful. And I thought, okay, I'm going to learn something about each of these companies. So I would read the little top paragraph, and then I would memorize the symbol. And then I would go into the trading room and watch the tickers go by and test myself on whether or not I knew every single ticker. And then that year, I asked Mr. Burden if I could take the New York Stock Exchange broker exam. And I thought, if he says no, that's fine. But I said to him, I think I can pass it. He said yes. And so by the time I was 21, I was a broker on the New York Stock Exchange. I didn't end up actually doing that. But to me, George Burden was one of my mentors. Not long after that, he sent me to New York. I had been to New York once before, but he told me that they needed to close a deal. I didn't even know what a deal was. And he said, we need you to take the shuttle to New York, and there'll be a car for you, and it will take you to 5 different places, and each place is one of the investors in the investment, and you'll collect 5 checks for $1 million each. So I flew down to New York the next morning. I came back that evening with $5 million in my handbag, and I turned it over to him, and he said, okay, he said, thank you, this was great, and Godfrey and I are going to take you out to dinner at the Ritz. So we went up to the Ritz on Arlington Street in Boston. And there I saw, it was like the most beautiful place I'd ever been in my life. And he said, order anything you want. And they were, of course, having their 2 martinis. And that night I lay in bed and I just thought to myself, maybe one day I can have the life that they're leading. And he was a big portion by giving me a lot of rope.
At some point around here or later in your life, you must have looked back and said, well, within these walls, I wonder what's out there. And you get out there and say, well, this isn't so bad.
Well, you are right about that. Well, I was very frightened about the world. And I, in my new book, I talk about, I was a cultural infant, honestly. And I had never heard a swear word. I had never heard a slang word. I couldn't tell you one baseball player or one movie actress. And one time on the bus going into Boston, this man, very lovely gentleman sitting next to me, turned and very quietly said, has anyone ever told you you look like Lauren Bacall? I had no idea who Lauren Bacall was. No idea. And I'm thinking to myself, Lauren Bacall, remember that name, find out who she is. And that night, I would have dinner with my mother. Just the only people in Still River that could see me while I was going to secretarial school were my parents. And every night I had dinner with my mother. And that night I said, Sister Elizabeth Ann, who is Lauren Bacall? And my mother suddenly got very animated. And I don't know whether she did this by mistake or for real. But here, nobody spoke about anything that had to do with the outside world. And she said, oh, darling, she's a beautiful actress. And I was kind of stunned because people didn't talk like that at the center. And then I thought, well, maybe she's sharing with me something about the real world. And then I thought, but how does she really know who Lauren Bacall is either? But of course, she came from a generation ahead of me. And I thought, somebody thinks I'm beautiful. And that was the first time it ever occurred to me that I was pretty or that I was anything other than, we were never told that I knew I was good in school. And I knew I had to get into those 2 colleges, but there were never any compliments, lest they go to our head. And we weren't supposed to care about them anyway. So I learned little by little.
You wrote about how guarded you were when you came out because you didn't know anything about the culture. And so in conversations, you would offer little because you had little. At some point that changed because then pretty soon you were writing about how asking questions and being curious was what enabled you to catch up quickly. How did that transition? Were there moments in that transition that you remember that were poignant?
Yes, I mean, once I was in the world of business, even if it was a receptionist, you weren't sitting around talking about, the Beatles. I made every endeavor to learn all about the music that was the music of the day, and I really, really, really came to like it. But there was all, I mean, everybody was smoking weed. I was so careful not to get involved with drugs. I thought my only asset was that I had a brain, and I thought if I screwed that one up, now that me, I'm not saying I didn't smoke any weed. I did, but I never did LSD, which was like the hot drug of the day. Never did cocaine, heroin, any of those things. And so I was, very naive, but I used to go to these parties and they were all strobe lights. You're probably too young to remember all this. Strobe lights and, marijuana haze and all this kind of stuff. But for me, it was really helpful that there was so much noise because that meant I never had to ask a question, never had to open my mouth. And I just listened and listened and listened. And pretty soon I started to get the hang of things. And I think there are some ways even today that I'm somewhat naive. I can't even go into a cafeteria without getting nervous because I didn't grow up with a cafeteria. And so I'm always going like, oh, where are the napkins? Where's the utensils? Where are this? And I'm going like, I just wish I could walk into a cafeteria and pick up a plate and fill it up with my food and walk out the way everybody else does. But I have an insecurity about them because I never, ever, ever grew up in a cafeteria. So there are ways in which you get around, you figure it out. But I by the time I was having to do things such as go to New York, I mean, I just followed the rules. I knew exactly what I had to do, and all I wanted to do was make them happy. And I volunteered to do a lot of things, and that was very self-fulfilling. When you do something and you offer, I mean, I'd say to people, be adaptable. Make yourself invaluable. And I think that was something I learned. And maybe it was easier to make myself invaluable than sit around talking about things I didn't know about. So I was just applying myself constantly to do the next thing that would get me a little bit farther up the ladder. And some people could say, well, why didn't you hate your parents? And, why do you think they let this happen to them? All I knew is as a child, and I was pretty precocious, and I kept my eyes open all the time, I never blamed them. I always felt that my parents were coerced into doing what they did. I always felt they did it against their will. And one of the strongest indications was that my father, in particular, broke the rules. And we never celebrated birthdays. We only celebrated feast days. But on my birthday, which was in August, and on his birthday, which was in July, we would find each other. And he would just whisper to me, happy birthday, my little princess. And I would just find him on his birthday. His job at the center was, again, this is one of the reasons I'm very convinced that it was a cult, even though I never mentioned the word cult in my first book. All the intellectual people within the community were given menial jobs. And my father was given one that I actually thought was fabulous because it let me see him all day long. And he was responsible for fixing the automobiles that we had, along with a couple of the other big brothers. And whenever we would go from one house to the other, so one of the houses was where the children lived, where the grown women, the big sisters lived, and where we were taught our school. The other house was where the grown men lived and where we had, Sister Catherine had her office, all of our kitchens, all of our refectories, the chapel, and everything like that. So half a dozen times a day, anyone might be going back and forth. And so we would have breakfast in the main house, go and have school, come back for lunch, go back for school, come back for dinner. And so he was often under the hood of a car, but he kept his eyes open for all 5 of his children. And whenever he saw any of us, he would just do this, just wiggle his pinky. That to me gave me such joy. And it was the glue that just held me together till I was allowed some 3-4 months later to be able to talk to him. Sister Catherine would allow us to have what she called a community meeting every 3 or 4 months. And for 45 minutes, the families could sit together. And so my parents were always there early. And then all 5 of us sat together. And having that happen over and over again, observing how Sister Catherine was seriously annoyed at my father for his breaking of the rules, convinced me completely that this was not what he wanted to do. And many years later, when everybody came out, Sister Catherine died only a couple of years after she tossed me out. I talked to him about that. And he said that they felt we were getting the best Catholic education, and they didn't want to disrupt that, even though it totally disrupted their lives and our lives also as a family.
Well, you spoke about something that I think played a role in the rest of your life with regards to your dad, when you talked about fairness, and you were holding his hand one day and his wedding ring wasn't on it.
Oh, yes.
And that
Yes.
really struck me. And you know, success in business has a lot to do with fairness.
Yes. So from the time I was a tiny child, I loved my father's wedding ring. It had tiny, tiny, tiny little beads on it. And so I would hold his hand and I would play around with the little beads on the top. And then when we moved to Still River, one day I was Sunday early on, so we still saw our parents, like, let's just say once a week. Then she started canceling all of that. And I went to hold his hand and walk with him. And I said, "Where's your ring?" And he said, "It's in here." And a very Catholic thing that people wear is something called a scapula. And the parents were told to take their rings off. And so he put his inside his scapular. And many years later, before he had left the center, he said, "If I die while I'm up there, I want you to put this ring back on my finger so that I am buried with the world knowing that I am a married man." But so then I looked and saw my mother didn't have her ring, and she had a little diamond ring. And I asked her where that was. And she had put it in a statue of baby Jesus. And I just thought about that. And then Sister Catherine, who came into our refectories every single night, I looked at her hand and she still had her ring on her finger. She was married and her family lived about 25, 30 miles away. And while none of the parents could talk to each other or talk to their children, she went home to her family 3 times a week. Wednesday, Saturday, and Sunday. Believe me, I knew the days she was gone, and many of us just breathed a sigh of relief when she would drive off the property. And for me, I thought, okay, the rules are for everyone but her. And for me, that was unfair. And I think I have tried very hard in my life to make sure things are not discriminatory against people for no reason other than you have power and they don't. And so it was just a lesson to be learned, but I had to keep all of that to myself. I never said to my parents, "Why does she have a ring on her finger?" I just observed. Many of the little children didn't know where she was going when she left. I knew she had a husband. I knew she had 2 children. And so, I mean, I haven't become overwrought about it, but to me, life was not fair.
And it's not that hard to make things fair. You know, and I found that in business, those who were successful and ran successful organizations knew how to be fair about what was going on, or they would stop being successful.
Well, I agree with you. I think the greatest leaders are people who allow their employees to grow at their own rate. They give them as much rope as they can.
It's an element of trust.
It absolutely is. It is. And you have to show that to your employees, that you do trust them and you're willing to, not constrict them, but let them do it. And the mentors that I had were phenomenal that way, from the first to the last. And in every case, I mean, I think I've told you, or in the book, one mentor I had for less than 3 months, and he was unbelievably valuable to me. If you want, we can go into some of the stories, but I look at each mentor in a very different way. The one that was from the Harvard Business School, entirely different, but it's such an important two-way street. And what I try to tell young people today is, don't be afraid to ask for help. If you work for someone, go in and say, I don't understand this. Will you explain it to me? And that was what I did when I moved to Philadelphia. I was 23 at the time, and I was going to work for 6 analysts. And 4 of them were interviewing me, and I just said, I don't want to just put numbers on a piece of paper for you. I want you to tell me that if I come with asking you, why do these numbers do this? And what does this mean? That you will help me. And they all promised to do it, and they all did it. And so I learned, I came out of that 2-year period going from being really a secretary / number cruncher to being an analyst.
So in that, having been in the investment world myself for my career, it is that curiosity, that the next question. It's, what are the questions that you're asking? How quickly can you get to the truth behind what you see? That's what makes people really good at investing. And it was in that vein, as you did that it sounds like that contributed to the title of this book, The Witch of Wall Street, which you knew I had to get to.
Well,
tell us about
yes.
how you learned about that.
Well, I learned about that only 5 years ago. So here I am, 75 now. And on my 70th birthday, some of my Wall Street friends, 3 women from Wall Street, were throwing me a party. And at some point in the evening, people started taking the mic and telling funny stories. And one of them was one of those 3 women. And she told me that she had been at Bear Stearns, and it was 1985. And by then I'd been a portfolio manager for 4 years. And the head of institutional sales came to her and said, we've got this very large account at Citibank, and there's one woman that runs a lot of the money, but we have a problem. I'm embarrassed to say this. I put numerous salesmen on her account, and all the men are afraid of her. And I thought, good gravy. What? I mean, I'm just listening to this for the first time. And so she's telling the story, and he said, I'd really like you to take on the account and see if you can build a nice relationship with her, because it's a very big and very important account. And she said, I knew the name of this woman. I had never met her, but all I knew is when you went down to the trading room floor at Bear Stearns, they referred to her as the Witch of Wall Street. And I nearly fell on the floor. That was the first time, literally 5 years ago, the first time I had ever heard of that moniker applied to me.
See what a little curiosity will get you?
So I thought, oh my God, I wanted to die. I was embarrassed. I thought, how could this possibly happen? And for days and weeks, I thought about it. And I thought, my gosh, there are lots of women that get ahead. Are they all called witches? And then I kind of put it away. But as I went to write this book, I had friends said, oh, no, that's fabulous. You have to put that somewhere in the title. I said, don't be ridiculous. I'm not a witch, and I don't want to tell young women being a witch is what they should do. And they said, no, there are good witches. Witches do things that, they have magic in them. I thought, okay, whatever. But it was so, interesting. And I thought so hard and long about it. And then I started to see it through a different lens. And I realized, yes, I know I broke some china along the way. There is no doubt about it. And maybe I didn't in front of you, but there were,
You didn't.
but I realized that I could be very tough. I wanted the best execution. I wanted the most information. I had been a research analyst. I knew what I needed to know before, you know, I was going to buy a stock, and then I knew the price I wanted, et cetera, et cetera. And so I thought about it, and I thought, but you know, some of those characteristics, if they're in a man, leadership and, you know, attention to detail and impatience and, you know, drive, they're the ones that are considered leadership qualities.
There are different words than witches for the guys who are like that.
Yeah, they're like the Wolf of Wall Street or whatever, even though that was the stupidest movie in the world. And then, but when a woman does it, she gets named a witch. And or maybe they weren't even really thinking of it with a W. I don't know. And then I thought, you know what? I'm going to take this as a badge of honor and not be upset about it anymore. So I have, and I think it's a little bit of a comment on where women are in the workforce. And I'm not saying that it isn't a lot better than it was, but I also think the world environment, particularly in the world of finance, I think will always be a bigger challenge for women than it will be for men. It's just the real world. And I talk to women about that a lot because, you know, I think that many people in the world of finance look at every person that they hire in a powerful position, a strong position, as an entity that it has to have a return on investment. And so that return on investment is in large measure a function of how successful you are and your longevity with the firm. And I think there is still a point of view, subliminally maybe, where people think, but she might leave and go home and have children. And I think that they're unwilling. I'm not saying it's deliberate, but I think they are unwilling to expect the same out of a woman as they are out of a man, even though they do it over and over and over again.
Yes. Well, what is so great about the second book is how important having children was to you and how much of the book you talk about the transition and all of the challenges about even thinking about it and then doing it. Let's talk about that a little bit, because in many ways it's a transition to an entirely different career in many ways, and it speaks to you know, I'm not sure resilience is the right word in this case, because it's the flexibility of changing what you're doing every day and what your objectives are. Why don't we talk about that?
Yes, well, I was 36 or 37. I don't know why I can never remember the age when I got married. And I remember wondering to myself if I could be as a good wife and be a good businesswoman. I knew I could do the business part, but then I thought, wow, you're going to be married and, you know, you've got to make sacrifices and do different things. That seemed to go pretty wonderfully. And then I turned 40. My husband, whom you knew very well, my husband had 3 children, all in their teenage years. So when we got married, he wasn't jumping at the idea of having more children. And I just thought, just keep things quiet. I'm not going to making demands. But 3 years later, I was 40. And we were having a lovely dinner at the Coke Basque in Manhattan. And the words just came out of me. I had to talk.
You popped the question.
Well, I simply said, we need to talk about something. And I said, I don't want to have this conversation 10 years from now when I'm an angry woman at the age of 50 because I didn't bring it up now. And I said, I've always wanted children, and I really still want children, and I want us to have that discussion. He was surprised. It was not what he thought was going to come out. And we had discussions. We thought about it long and hard. And when he jumped on board, it was with both feet. And we then spent the next 5 years doing our best till we finally had twins. And I was 45 years old and he was 55 years old. And so now he was the father of 5 and continuing on in his career. And then I thought, okay, now I've got to be a wonderful wife, as good a wife as I can be, as good a mother as I can be, and as good an investment person as I can be. And I told myself, that's it, stop climbing the corporate ladder. You've reached a point, take more time. And I tried to do that. And I did do it, but of course we had full-time help. And then all of a sudden, another opportunity would come along within, I stayed with basically the same firm for years and I would jump at it.
Yeah, they needed your help in new, bigger ways, right? I mean, that's
and I
what
kept
happens.
thinking, I can fit all these things in, all these things in, all these things in. And then it was in 1999. I mean, I was traveling around the world. I was trying to do it much faster than I used to, just so I could get home. And then in 1999, we were on a vacation up in Rhode Island. And John came home with the children. They were 5 years old. And he said to me, we've been at the beach all day and you've been on conference calls all day. And he said, this is not a vacation for you. And I realized how true that was. And that night, I lay awake a long time. And when I woke up the next morning, I said to John, on Tuesday, it was Labor Day weekend. On Tuesday, when we go back into town, I am going to tell them that I am retiring at the end of the year. And I did it. And there was a wonderful party for me at the end of the year. And I gave this very extemporaneous speech and lots of people were crying. And I was going, I feel so strong. I feel so wonderful. Yes, I've loved working with these people, but I've made this decision and I know it's the right decision. And so I walked away from Wall Street at the age of 51 and had no idea what would really happen, except that I knew it was smart to stay in touch. And little by little, a second career developed as an expert witness and as a board member, a corporate board member, which lasted me another 25 years. And now only at 75 have I found ageism impacting me. And I have had to retire from 2 corporate, 1 mutual fund and 1 corporate board because I'm 75 years old. So I've got to find my next career now.
You got to get around to breaking that glass too. Well, and you've successfully raised 2 twins to, the same age as my daughter.
Yes, I remember when you had your children.
Exactly.
But yes, I mean, they're on their own now. One of them is in the world of finance and the other's in the world of social help to people. And I think it's wonderful. 30 years old and they have wonderful relationships. And I feel I did things entirely different from the way Sister Catherine did. And the outcome was wonderful. I do remember our children sometimes saying, I remember Caroline once said to me, Mom, why did you and Dad wait so long to have me? And I said, honey, if we'd had you any earlier, it wouldn't be you. Thought about that and went, okay.
I'd love to talk about your nonprofit.
Yes.
And how that came to be and because that's a very important component to all of this in my view. It's not just that you've had a career and raised a family and been a wife and and adapted your career in so many different ways. It's also you've created something that's unique.
Well, I started giving back, and I did think when I left Wall Street, I certainly wanted to get engaged, and I did locally here in town, and I was on the board of the Bruce Museum, and I was on the board of the YW, and all, a lot of things like that. And I think that, that pro bono work is very important. I also started mentoring, young girls, and I continue to do that, mentoring girls in high school and college. But it was about 8 years ago when I was sitting on a board of a not-for-profit healthcare company for members of the LGBTQ community. And I had become quite involved on the financial side of it because that was really where my strengths lay. And then for some reason, I just decided that wasn't the right place for me. And I left, but I had come to understand kind of how an organization like that works. And I turned to a friend of mine, a lawyer friend of mine, who had done some pro bono work helping me, decide what I wanted to do on that front. And I said, I think we can do this ourselves. I don't know how many words those are. They were the most fateful words. I mean, it was only 8 years ago. I was 60, whatever, 7 years old. And I co-founded this with a couple of other people. And it took a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. It really, really did. And today it's called Anchor Health, and it supports the LGBTQ community in Connecticut. And today we have, 30 employees, 4,000 patients, 2 offices, and we're about to open a 3rd office. We have a hugely dedicated group of employees, many of whom are within the LGBTQ community. And I am the pro bono CEO. I've never taken a dime and never will. I've funded it for a long period of time, but we're in the black now. We are in the black, and I think the future is phenomenal. We have young, energetic, truly dedicated people, and we are doing a service that is much needed. And in some states, it's hard to get now. And we have patients now coming to us from outside the state of Connecticut, moving to Connecticut because they can't find the care that they need in their own states. And I think that's part of our mission, and it's a holy mission, I think. And I know that, the place where I grew up, they have in essence said that I am supporting a lifestyle that is in contrast and contrarian to the Catholic lifestyle. And I said, no, you don't get it. I am engaged in the corporal work of mercy, which is to feed the hungry, to give drink to the thirsty, to clothe the naked, to take care of the sick, etc. And I said, that's the way I look at it. And I look at it as a role like Mother Teresa, not that I'll ever achieve her heights, but as what you do for one person, you do for Christ, for God, for whoever.
It's worthy having role models, and Mother Teresa is an awfully good one.
Yes, she is. And she's a nun, no less. Oh my goodness.
So tell me, so you've spanned these decades where you were really a pioneer woman. Tell me about what you've seen about societal progress and how you have watched it, where, what your confidence is in how it naturally evolves, or how much push is required to get it going in the right direction. How do you view it as progress, or is it not necessarily progress, but simply change? How much better is the world today as you've watched society, as you've moved through your life? How do you see our society as changing and evolving?
Well, for someone who was brought up in a very regimented way, this tiny little narrow sliver of humanity were the only people that were going to go to heaven. And I kind of rebelled against that innately. I have found it's taken many decades in a way, but I have really come to relish seeing the good in other people and appreciating people who come from very different walks of life, who have maybe not been given the same opportunities that I've been given, and watching people really try to move forward. And I think there are different ways of looking at people. I think there's a whole set of our society that thinks that people are lazy and aren't trying to do work. And if they're not successful, it's their own fault. And I'll tell you, when I first was young and working my way up, I used to think that anyone could bootstrap themselves. And I realized that's not true. and that some people are burdened with terrible emotional illnesses and terrible backgrounds and histories that they can't shake. And so just the opportunity to understand that we all come at it in a different way, to me, makes me see ways that lots of people can be of value. I mean, let's just think about the whole world of the challenges of people with mental illness. And now there are opportunities for people. It still can be very complicated for them. And I think in the world of business, I used to be a little bit concerned that boards of directors needed to have these particular criteria. And now I look at boards of directors with people who are widely diverse, and diverse backgrounds, diverse upbringings, diverse careers makes for diverse thinking. And diverse thinking is part of what you need, I think, to make a successful company. And I think that there's much more of that. There's more of that in Europe than there is, I think, in this country. It's quite interesting for me to look around the world and see that there are far more third world countries that have women leaders than first world countries that have women leaders. And people will say, oh, they dumb everything down, et cetera, et cetera. I think the opportunities are much greater for women than they used to be, but I still think you have to work extremely hard to be successful in getting to the top. And I'm not sure that will ever change, but we even see in third world countries now, unfortunately, Afghanistan undid it all, but while we were there as a presence for a quarter of a century, young girls were learning to read and were going to university. So to me, all those observations to me are proof that it's important to change the world. I mean, look, we see what's going on in Iran, and how the women want to be educated and to have their own careers. And sometimes you hear other things in this country where you almost feel that there's a segment of our population that wants to shut down opportunities. But I think that door is not going to close anymore. I think it's there for the long haul. And I think, I sat on a board where I just had to come off. We have 13 board members, the majority of whom are women. And so that never happened. I was the first woman there, and it was a decade before a second woman came on. So to me, it's best to just keep letting things rolling along as opposed to becoming agitated that they're not moving fast enough.
The reality is that you were in a situation where you took the best things from the center and it allowed you to succeed however it worked, while others who had the same situation in the center did not wind up having the same experience as you, men and women. And that there is a lot more that's going on within you that leads to all these things. It leads you to get these mentors. It leads you to figure out how to handle situations that other people feel impede or they feel it impedes their ability to progress, or it actually impedes their ability to progress. And but it's very important for the world to know that there is a way out, no matter what, no matter how bad things are. And that's kind of what this channel is all about. And it's not on an individual level so much as it is a societal level, which is why I asked that last question. But the reality is that society progresses. It progresses, especially if you look at the global society. Poverty has collapsed in the last 100 years. Democracy has flourished over the last 100 years. It's stalled out in the last 20. And Alex Gladstein is the guest that I had a couple weeks ago who went through all the stats. He works for the Human Rights Foundation. Watching society over these decades and having gone through a form of injustice in your childhood, what do you think about injustice as a concept. Is this something that is cyclical, or are we entering a period in your experience? Have you seen it decline, and do you have confidence that it will continue to decline?
Well, I'm not a historian, but if one does take a kind of long-term approach, it does appear that the state of living in the world is better than it was 200 years ago, 100 years ago. I mean, slavery has been abolished in our country, and it's been abolished for all intents and purposes around the world as the accepted norm. Does that mean that everyone who might have been a slave is living a wonderful life today? No, but there are at least opportunities that are not denied to you purely on the basis that you're a slave, can never own property, never make an income, and things like that. On the front of medicine, huge amounts of human power and ingenuity have gone into making the world a safer place. And I think when the world is a safer place from a health standpoint, it leads to better outcomes for people. And so I think that there's a long-term trend towards betterment. That being said, we know that around those long-term trends, there are ups and downs. And, you just, as we were saying, World War II and World War I, two of the most hideous wars in the history of the world, were a function of it being in a modern society. So with the good that comes from a modern society, there is also the potential of even more disruption. But I think any one of us would raise their hand and say, I'd rather be born today than at the time of the Roman Empire. And, once the Gutenberg Bible came out, suddenly people had the ability to read on their own, to learn to read on their own, and impact their own futures in a way they never could do when they were illiterate. So those kinds of giant steps that move forward are very positive. I mean, I love to look and talk to people who have really bootstrapped themselves. And they're generally very happy. There's not an animosity, I beat this system. They made it part of their life to take the good and do as much with it as they can. I think in a way, governments, I've come to learn to respect the role of government in a way that I didn't when I was much younger, and thinking that everybody could bootstrap, but they can't. Just watching in the last 10 years, the minimum wage in this country, at least double. I mean, that provides a level of humanity that doesn't exist when you are so poor that you have to be on the dole from the government, or the taxpayers end up, supporting the employees of very large corporations. So to me, I have a tendency to see the world as evolving into a better place. I hope that's a little bit helpful.
It feels that the individual has more ability to make a difference in today's world than they used to.
And I think one of the things that for me, I feel is so important in this country, and something that we have thrived on, but seems to be somewhat under threat today, is we have always been a country that brought in labor from around the world. And to me, that makes this country why it is so successful. We are an open society in that regard. And I think that is something that we need to make sure we don't shut down.
Well, Patricia, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Well, it was all my pleasure.
And if you want to know more about Patricia, you can go to patriciachadwick.com. Is that right?
That's correct. That's correct.
And definitely buy her books because they are amazing. Patricia, have a great weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Take care.